This presentation, titled ISO 9001 Auditing Practices Group, comes to us from Denise Robitaille. Denise is the chair of ISO PC 302, the project committee that revised ISO 19011, which provides guidance on auditing. She's an active member of ISO TC 176 Auditing Practices Group that develops papers providing guidance on auditing. Denise has participated internationally in standards development for more than 18 years and is a fellow of the American Society for Quality, as well as an exemplar global certified lead assessor. She's an internationally recognized for her work and is a frequent speaker at conferences. In addition to her books, Denise has contributed more than 100 articles to various publications on a variety of quality-related topics. She continues to help companies achieve ISO 9001 registration and to improve their quality management systems. Denise has authored a dozen books, including the 9 Keys to Successful Audits. And with that, take it away, Denise.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. And welcome, everyone. Today, I would like to introduce you to the ISO 9001 Auditing Practices Group. And this is their website, and I will provide you with the URL for that in just a moment. This is where you will go to find a variety of really well-developed papers on a whole bunch of different things having to do with auditing, both general auditing and with auditing to ISO 9001. And here again is the URL. It will be repeated at the end of this presentation as well. And so let's talk a little bit about who the APG is, the Auditing Practices Group. So this group is made up from a whole bunch of experts that are derived from the same kind of individuals that you would find involved in standards development. So the folks that work on international standards like ISO 9001, AS 9100, and all of the different documents that are in the portfolios for both of those documents. And they represent people who are involved in managing quality management systems. They are consultants, they are practitioners, they are auditors, but they're all deemed as experts. And as I said, these are the folks who bring you 9001 and all of these other quality management systems. They come from around the world, they represent different cultures and a whole variety of different industries. The second group of folks that they are derived from who participate in the APG is the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. Their focus is more on conformity assessment. They are the ones who will promulgate the rules for your accreditation bodies, your certification bodies, all of those rules that you find having to do with third-party audits. And again, they're more focused on the auditing aspect, but again, same high caliber of technical experts who participate with us in the development of these standards. And how do we work? How do we do this? Well, we do meet a minimum of once a year, and that's usually at the TC 176 plenary. TC 176 is a technical committee for ISO 9001, and they have a plenary once a year. We met most recently last November in Barbados, and at that meeting we come together to work on standards and on papers. Beyond that, we do a great deal of work virtually, and so we will meet online utilizing either Zoom, WebEx, or some other comparable platform in order to do further work on the variety of papers that we develop. So what exactly is it that is the output of all of our work? Well, we produce a whole bunch of guidance papers, and these papers relate to a whole variety of different aspects having to do with general requirements around auditing, some interesting aspects having to do with auditing that are not normally documented, or there's not a whole bunch of guidance written about them. The primary focus is 9001, although that may be changing, and I'll talk about that in a few more slides. But primarily right now we are focused on 9001, and a lot of the papers deal specifically with different requirements that are, again, specific to 9001. In all instances, or in many of the instances, I should say, they do reflect this whole concept of process-based auditing, the process approach to your quality management system. And so that is embedded in many of these papers and really help auditors to understand how to approach auditing through this process-based approach. So who exactly are we targeting our products to? A whole bunch of different folks, both auditors, consultants, practitioners, basically anyone. Anyone can go to the website, access the website, and download these papers. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But because of the variety of folks who can avail themselves of these papers, they also represent a whole bunch of different perspectives and different views on audits. So some of the ways in which the papers might be different. So there's not going to be consistency in how they're written. You're accustomed to, if you see a standard that's been developed as an ISO standard that's gone through the balloting process, that it has a particular format to it, that it will have the forward, and it has the disclaimers, and everything is the scope and all of these other sections. A lot of these papers do not follow that pattern. So you have a whole variety of different formats. You have some that are written in Word and then saved as PDFs. You also have some PDFs that actually started out as PowerPoint presentations. So you've got those different formats, some more text, others that have a great deal of charts and graphs and other illustrations that are extremely helpful. The people writing these represent different cultures, different countries, different languages, and because of different languages, you're not going to find the same level of sophistication sometimes in the writing styles. So the writing styles are also not always consistent. And the papers will reflect the perspective coming from a whole variety of different industries. People who participate in the APG come out of the petroleum industry and medical device, telecommunications, aerospace, surface industries. So you have what they perceive as important and critical to their various industries. And they also represent different sector schemes. Right now, although it's primarily focused on 9001, some of the people also involved in AS 9100, TL 9000, and the automotive standard ATF 16949. So because of that, although they all have that same level of rigor in terms of the experts, they're going to vary greatly, and there's not one particular style or format that you're going to see these in. That having been said, there's great benefits to be derived out of these, and some of it actually is derived from the various perspectives and the different formats in which they're presented. They provide guidance on a whole variety of concepts, like more specific details on how to put together a checklist, the pros and cons of having a checklist. You have some really neat presentations that have to do with the value that can be derived from auditing, and that in and of itself is something that is very useful. It's something that can be presented to top management to help them to understand what benefits they can derive from utilizing a good auditing program. And again, as previously mentioned, you're going to have tips for best practices for specific requirements or things that are very specific to certain industries. The other thing is that it's going to have some stuff that is very that can be a lot more prescriptive than what you would find a standard. Standards are intended to be generic. They require that you focus on certain specific requirements. These papers allow you to go beyond that and say, these are some of the ways in which you can apply your own activities to fulfill these requirements. So they get into much more detail than is possible or appropriate to have in a more generic standard. So again, with those details, you get a lot more benefit from it. A couple of disclaimers. Although these papers are developed by technical experts, they are not intended to add any specific requirements or benchmarks for any industry. You can't have someone who is an auditor who is focused, let us say, and has all their expertise in the automotive industry, going to these papers and pointing to an APG paper and saying, well, the papers out of the auditing practices group say that you should do this, because none of these papers are intended to create additional requirements. They do not augment the requirements of the standard. They're intended to illuminate and to provide more guidance. So they are not, they don't constitute mandatory criteria. No one can point to these and say, these are the requirements of 9001, and you can go to these papers and there's going to be extra requirements here. That's not the intent. And again, that's not the way in which these papers are intended to be utilized. Another thing that we have to bear in mind is, despite the fact that you can have the assurance that these papers are indeed developed by some technical experts with an extraordinary amount of experience, that these papers are not endorsed and are not balloted in the same way as, for example, an ISO 9001 standard or 14001. These standards go through a rigorous process. There's multiple balloting, there's public commenting, etc. These papers do not go through that process. They go through internal reviews. And again, you have the confidence that they are written by some very qualified technical experts, but they have not gone through that balloting process. They are intended to be provided to the public for educational purposes and to help people to communicate the different requirements in a way that is more comprehensible to them. So what exactly are we doing? Well, we are writing papers, and this is the main product, the main output of the APG. So we're not engaged in providing any consultancy. We don't do any of those things. Our big thing that we do is that we write papers. A few weeks ago, that slide would have said there are 41 papers. As of 2 weeks ago, there are 42. And we'll talk in a few moments about the newest paper that we've added, because it is very, very timely. So these papers are up on the website. They may be downloaded, and downloading is very, very easy, and they are free. You do not have to belong to a particular organization. You do not have to be a member of any standards body. You do not have to pay any dues. You do not have to do anything. If you are able to go to the URL and click it on and get to the website, you may have access to these papers for free. One of the other things that the APG does do is we are a bit of a clearinghouse. Occasionally, the user community will send in requests for interpretations for various requirements within ISO 9001, and TC 176 does have a very formal process for reviewing these questions and determining whether or not they are going to publish a formal interpretation. Before they do that, they send them to the audit practices group so that we may review it and see if there is a paper that provides clarification so that the interpretation process does not have to be initiated. So that is a benefit that we provide. And the other thing is that it mitigates the amount of interpretations, the official interpretations that are ultimately published. Because if you have a requirement and then you have to go to the official interpretations to better understand them, that can be a cumbersome process. And sometimes it actually diminishes some of the confidence that people have in the integrity of a particular requirement. So we are a clearinghouse to help with that particular process. So that's pretty much what we do. So this first slide, I understand, is not something that you can read too easily, but I wanted you to just have that screenshot that shows this is what you're going to go to in order to be able to download these. The next slide brings it in so we have a little bit more magnification here, a little bit more clarity. You can see here all of the different papers. This is only the top half. There is a whole bunch more that obviously could not fit on one screenshot. Any one of those papers can be uniquely downloaded. You just click it on, it'll go there, you can download it, save it to your own computer. You will notice that there's also at the end of each grouping this thing that says zip file for all of the above. So you can actually zip all of them and download them all at the same time. So again, it is really easy to be able to get access to all of these great papers and to be able to derive all the benefit that you can from them. So before we go on to talking about all some of the neat stuff that you find in the papers, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about some of the recent activities that the Auditing Practices Group has been involved in. One of the things that we are considering doing is expanding the scope of the APG to include ISO 14001. Now that is Technical Committee 207, and TC 207 is involved in writing environmental management system standards. So you saw the page that I had up before where you had the general auditing papers, and then farther down you have those that are specific to ISO 9001. It is our vision, and we'll see how well that plays out in the next year or so, to have a separate link that would take it so that one link would take you to 9001 guidance papers and the other would be to guidance papers on 14001. Whether or not we would expand that beyond to any other technical groups or groups of papers is something that would need a considerable amount of deliberation after we roll out 14001. So that's one of the activities that we considered and we talked about when last we met. The other thing that we did is that we released a new paper that has to do with the scope and applicability requirements within ISO 9001. That's one of the requirements that has created a lot of confusion amongst auditors. Prior editions of 9001 had requirements having to do with exemptions, and that has changed from the concept of non-applicability. And so those things are discussed in that paper. So it was timely to put forth that paper because we had recognized that there was a need for clarification. The next one, which we had originally expected to publish perhaps in the third or fourth quarter of 2020, has to do with remote auditing. And obviously with the recent pandemic, it became very, very timely for us to put together this paper, move up the timetable on that. And so that paper was just released within the last 10 days and is now available for you to download. Now I want to call your attention to one of the plans that we have for later on in 2020, and that has to do with the development of a paper on auditing virtual processes. And so one of the things that is important, and it becomes very serendipitous at this moment to have both of these being discussed at the same time, because we have recognized that there is a great deal of confusion in terms of these two different concepts. Many people have and still continue to believe that remote auditing and virtual auditing, both of which are misnomers actually, are the same thing. In actuality, remote auditing, which is actually not a new kind of auditing, it is auditing processes remotely. And basically the focus of that has to do with geography. You're auditing things that are in an area that is removed from where you are. So the auditor is in one location, and the processes and documented information supporting those processes is geographically located in another place. And the manner in which you are able to audit those processes is described in this paper. Virtual auditing, by contrast, has to do with processes that are virtual. And what that means is that they do not have a place in time. They are outside of geography, if you will. So examples of some of the things that would fall into this category would be, for example, e-commerce, EDI, which is the electronic transfer of orders and data from one web portal to another without human intervention. The ability to utilize software-driven SPC in order to make automated adjustments to production equipment, again without human intervention. So all of those things are virtual processes. They exist in a virtual, in an electronic environment, and the focus on those is more related to auditing the processes that enable and validate the integrity of these tools that we use in order to be able to operate in a virtual environment. Two entirely different things. The paper on auditing virtual processes, again, we expect to be able to publish that paper before the end of 2020. Other projects in the pipeline, ISO 19011, which is the auditing standard having to do with guidance, was revised about 18 months ago. Some of the language in that standard has changed. Actually, it added some things having to do with the concept of remote auditing of processes and auditing virtual processes, but a whole bunch of other things that were added. So it is appropriate at this time to revise that particular document, that particular paper. And then we're going to put together a plan with some kind of schedule, looking at all these other papers that are due to be reviewed, and to determine whether or not some of them need to be revised or perhaps even withdrawn because their applicability may have changed. One of the really cool things about this is that you have the ability to provide feedback and to ask questions. So you can comment on a paper that you have read. You have an email address down below, charlescorey@bsigroup.com. He will take that email and he will channel it, route it to the appropriate individuals within the APG, and will decide, what actions to take on those comments. You can also suggest new papers. You can express what you believe is the need for a new paper to be developed, or you can look at some existing papers and make comments as to whether or not you believe that existing papers need to be revised. Now, there are quite a few papers that were put together based on ISO 9001-2008, and because there are a lot of these papers, we have not gotten around to revising all of them. So some of these may have dated references in them because of that. So it would not be inappropriate to say, this is a great paper, but we sure would like to see what the guidance would look like if we're looking at ISO 9001 2015. So that's some of the feedback that you can provide. So there is an opportunity for two-way dialogue on these papers. So that having been said, what I would like to do now, I'm not going to go through all of the papers, but what I would like to do is to basically cherry pick a few of them and talk about some of the really neat guidance that you find in that, so you get a sampling of some of the information, guidance, cool stuff that you can learn from downloading these papers. These slides, by the way, going forward will include a listing of all of the papers with the exception of the new one on auditing remotely, because that one was published after these slides were created. But other than that, if you go through all of these slides, all of them are listed here. But we're not going to go through all of them. We're just going to go through a few of them, just because some of them have some really cool stuff in them. The first one I'd like to call your attention to is the one on technical experts. In all of my years of auditing, I don't believe I have ever seen a paper, a document, anything published that really talks in detail on some of the issues that come up when you're utilizing a technical expert on your audit team. So this was a really cool paper for me to see had been put up there. So it talks about things like making sure that the technical expert understands his or her role, ensuring that technical experts do not have a conflict of interest. If, for example, the technical expert on a supplier audit happens to be someone from your production department who has more expertise on a particular process, that individual may wish to insert or exert more influence over the auditee during the course of the audit than is appropriate. We have to remind them that they are there to observe the process and to make comments on the process. They are always assigned to a particular auditor if there's an audit team. And they need to be reminded that they cannot issue any findings, that any findings that come up during the course of the audit have to be channeled through an auditor. That's just some of the guidance that came out of reading that particular paper, stuff I had never seen before. So I thought that was a really neat addition. The first one on the list has to do with adding value. I want to stop for a moment and remind you that when we talk about auditing, we're talking about first party, second party, and third party audits. So those would be internal audits, supplier audits, and conformity assessment or certification audits. And so there's going to be different perspectives on these different things. For example, technical experts would be different if it was a supplier audit than it was a third party audit. Similarly, when we're talking about value, that value is going to be have a different perspective depending on what kind of audit that you're looking at. So let's say that it is adding value from the perspective of a first-party audit. Then what kind of information do you give to top management so that they understand how important and how valuable auditing is to their organization? Ensuring that you can add value to either a second or a third-party audit by making sure that the auditee understands requirements without you getting into consultation mode as an auditor, because it is not appropriate for auditors to be consultants. So how do you do that? How do you create value? How do you ensure, for example, that the auditee understands requirements and do that in a way that does not put you in a consultancy road but adds that value? The other thing about adding value is that in some cases, especially with first and second party audits, you can make comments about the maturity of a system. And that's something that can also be assessed during the audit. So again, great paper, good guidance. This next one on the list has a really neat paper on how do you deal with consultants. I've seen a little bit written on this, but again, this puts it together very nicely. Uh, how does, for example, a third-party auditor deal with consultants, making sure that it's communicated to the auditee that you're auditing their system and not the consultant's system? Make it clear what you want the consultant's role to be during the course of that audit, that they are observers. However, you have to decide at what point during the course of that audit you will allow the consultant to intercede if it's apparent that the auditor is embroiled in too much ISO speak or jargon that the auditee, the person being interviewed, does not understand, so that they can clarify the situation. Some of the guidance in there, but just this thing of how do you deal with consultants, a great paper to have. So let's cherry pick on here for the next one. There are several on this list that are really cool. The second one on there having to do with effectiveness. This one provides great guidance on how do you go about, as an auditor, determining if a process or a quality management system is effective. Now, it is a requirement for an auditor to determine not only conformance but effectiveness. So this one has some really cool examples of some of the things that you can utilize in order to determine, what models that the organization might be utilizing in order to be able to determine effectiveness. How is that information developed? How is it communicated within the organization? Particularly, it ties some of this to the requirements having to do with quality objectives, improvement, management review, and it illustrates it all, again, using, as I mentioned earlier on, the concept of process approach. So it gives some really cool guidance for auditors on how do you assess the evidence that the organization is providing in order to be able to determine if either a process or the entire quality management system is effective. The next one on the list I want to talk about is electronic documented information systems. And in actuality, this is one of the examples of a paper that may ultimately be replaced by some of the papers that are being developed now, like, for example, the one having to do with auditing of virtual processes. So it's a precursor to some of these new papers. But for a long time, it provided really good guidance for people who had not gotten beyond that point of where everything was in paper. You had the big honking binders, everything was either in hard copy, drawings were paper, nothing was CAD files that were, that could be accessed on the production floor. And so some of this stuff, and there are organizations who are still relatively new to the concept of electronic media for controlling their documented information, and for them this paper is very, very timely for them and will give them some good information. Evidence collection, some really basic stuff, good guidance. What do you collect? Reminding you, evidence is not always on a piece of paper. Some of the information that will provide evidence of fulfillment of requirements is not in a record. And what it does is it brings home the point is that not all of the evidence that you're going to need to be able to determine if requirements have been fulfilled, they are not going to be handed to you on a silver platter. It's not going to be, here's a piece of paper that will prove that I am compliant with this particular requirement. So some really good tips on collecting evidence, especially when it's not just that simple, here's the requirement, here's the piece of paper that shows that I fulfilled that requirement. Moving on to the next group here. This one, pardon me, has some good stuff having to do with the context of the organization. This is one of the requirements that was new to ISO 9001:2015. We're still talking about it as being new, but the standard's been out for almost 5 years now. But for some people, they're still struggling with how do we audit the requirements in Section 4 of ISO 9001 having to do with context of the organization. This particular paper shows some great examples of ways in which you can determine if the organization is fulfilling those requirements. They have examples around SWOT, which is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats model that's used. They list strategic planning and a whole bunch of other evidence that the audit team might provide that demonstrates that they are considering the context of their organization, the internal and external issues. There are, beyond that, examples having to do with interested parties, things that deal with scope. For example, for scope would be the locations, the products or services that are offered, and the quality management system and defining interrelation of processes. Very, very good paper for auditors who are struggling with this whole notion of concept. The other really cool paper in this particular grouping has to do with customer feedback. Many organizations feel as though they've got to do surveys. Some other organizations just have customer complaints and that's all they've got. This paper is great in terms of illustrating all of the different ways in which an organization can gather feedback from the customer that relates to how well they're fulfilling requirements, how well they are understanding not only today's requirements, but things that might be coming down the pike. It talks about things like warranty, articles in the media. It also talks about if they're gathering data through surveys and things like that, how is that information gathered? How is it analyzed? Are they getting the information that is really helping them? Again, very, very good paper. The next one is on this particular grouping, organizational knowledge. Here's another one that has really found a lot of auditors struggling to determine how exactly do we assess whether or not an organization has fulfilled the requirements around the clause dealing with organizational knowledge. So they've got a really neat diagram that has to do with determining what those requirements for organizational knowledge are and how they're deployed. Talks about the fact that how this is going to be deployed is going to vary widely across different size organizations, and remind you that it's going to be more formally implemented in some organizations than in others. Again, as in a lot of these others that I've mentioned, they deal with things that auditors have struggled with because the requirements are not as easy and as clear-cut as, for example, something to do with inspection or purchasing, where things are very, very clear-cut. Last paper here, right there down at the bottom, top management. What are the responsibilities of top management? What are the processes that top management owns? And sometimes when you audit, especially with a second or a third-party audit, you'll find that top management doesn't realize that they actually own processes. So what processes do they own? And how, as an auditor, do you ensure that they understand what processes they own, what their responsibilities are? And this may be the last one that I present, but it's probably one of the most important ones, especially considering that with the advent of ISO 9001 2015, the importance, the significance of top management engagement and responsibility was so much more heightened in this standard, and that everything flows down from that top management. With that, we are at the end of that brief sampling of the papers. I encourage you, go again, click on this URL and go and grab those papers. There's a lot of benefit to be derived. If you have any other questions about this, please email me. My email's on this, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you again, Mike.
Well, thank you, Denise Robitaille, for that expert look at the Auditing Practices Group for ISO 9001. And that concludes this presentation.